Supposed biblical error, the burial of Jesus. Skeptics often assert it is unlikely Jesus' body would have been buried in a tomb after being on the cross for one day, because the Romans preferred to leave crucified victims on their crosses for days as the body would rot. This would have been a powerful message to potential rebels of what would happen to them if they defied Rome. Then to shame the victims further, the bodies would have been thrown in an unmarked mass grave. And there is evidence to support this practice. Bart Ehrman cites several primary sources that suggest crucified victims were left on the cross to rot instead of being allowed a proper burial, as well as sources that show crucified victims were thrown in the mass graves. However, the problem with these sources is they do not specifically speak of Roman execution procedures in Judea during peacetime. Let's remember something we have noted in previous videos of this series, which is that Rome did not govern every territory the same. They left a lot of decisions on various matters to be conducted at the local level, which meant laws and procedures varied from province to province. And this seems to be the case for Judea prior to the events of the Jewish War. Philo tells us at one point the Jews appealed to Pilate to redress the infringement of their traditions caused by the shields and not to disturb the customs, which throughout all of the preceding ages had been safeguarded without disturbance by kings and by emperors. So it appears the standard practice was that their rituals and customs were safeguarded and allowed to continue on, and that Tiberius is not desirous that any of our laws or customs shall be destroyed. And then Philo tells us the Jews wrote a letter to Tiberius, who sided with them on the issue, confirming the notion the Jews were allowed to keep their sacred laws and customs. So it appears the standard practice was that their rituals and customs were safeguarded and allowed to continue on. Josephus agrees. In speaking of making idols or graven images, he says the Romans did not require their Jewish subjects to violate their national laws. Later he says, "We have trained our courage, not with a view to waging war for self-aggrandizement, but in order to preserve our laws. And there is not a Jew so distant from his country, so much in awe of a cruel despot, but has more fear of the law than of him." Elsewhere he says, "The Roman procurators who succeeded Agrippa I kept the peace by abstaining from all interference with the customs of the country." So the evidence suggests the Romans, during the time of mostly peaceful occupation, allowed the Jews to carry on with specific national customs and practices. And what we see in Jewish law supports the notion Jesus was buried, as the Gospels record. Deuteronomy 21 says a body cannot remain all night on a tree and must be buried the same day. This last section is important because it was about the purity of the land. It didn't matter if it was a Roman who killed someone on Jewish land. The body still had to be buried because it was on their land. So it was not just if a Jew executed someone. Josephus tells us the Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men that they took down those that were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. And against Appian, he also notes, "We must furnish fire, water, food to all who ask for them. Point out the road, not leave a corpse unburied. Show consideration even to declared enemies." Philo agrees and notes it was considered virtuous among the Jews to bury the dead. This is also seen in the book of Tobit, and the Dead Sea Scrolls might speak of burying those who were crucified. And also, the scholar Dale Allison highlights a passage from the Talmud, which says that the days of mourning were counted from the time that the relatives of a victim, executed by the government, despaired in their appeal to obtain the body from the authorities for burial, but had not given up hope of stealing it. This ruling, whose content is consistent with an origin in the early Roman period, implies that the relatives of executed criminals were accustomed to ask for the remains of a loved one. Some might argue the Jewish leaders would not have allowed an honorable burial for a rival and someone they perceived as a criminal, and so Jesus would have been placed in a mass grave. Well, this could be why the Gospel of John says that Joseph of Arimathea asked for the body in secret for fear of the Jews. But also, Jody Magnus, archaeologist and expert on Jewish burial practices, says Mishnah law attached no stigma to crucifixion. Only victims who were beheaded, strangled, stoned, or burned were said to not be allowed to be buried with their family. In fact, she notes we have evidence in the archaeological record of one crucified victim from Judea named Yohanan, who did receive an honorable burial and was eventually placed inside a bone box. In his heel was found a nail that was used in crucifixions. John Dominic Crossan suggests this one example was the exception to the rule. But Magnus points out Crossan's assumption that we should have the physical archaeological remains of additional crucified victims is erroneous for several reasons. First, minus one exception, not one undisturbed tomb in Jerusalem has ever been discovered and excavated by archaeologists. Most of what archaeologists find is damaged and incomplete. Second, most of the tombs would have belonged to wealthy elites who would have had the power and influence to avoid crucifixion. Most of crucified victims were of the lower class. Last, the nail in Yohanan's heel was only preserved by a fluke. The means by which victims were affixed to crosses usually leave no discernible traces in the physical remains or archaeological record. Dale Allison also notes that many crucified victims were tied up rather than being nailed, so we would not recognize them as having been crucified. More importantly, the nails used in crucifixion, which were prized as powerful amulets, were pulled out of the site of execution, and so not buried with the bodies. And Brian McCain says, if there had not been a knot strategically located in the wood of Yohanan's cross, the soldiers would have easily pulled the nail out of the cross. It would never have been buried with Yohanan, and we would never have known that he had been crucified. So it is surprising that we have identified even one. However, in the past decade, evidence for another crucified victim has been verified. In the Abba Cave was found the remains of someone who was beheaded, but also had an iron nail in their wrist. Scholars Niku Haas and Yul Elitzul argued that based on available evidence, these are the remains of the last Hasmonean king. Josephus tells us that he was beheaded, but Cassius Dio adds that he was bound to a cross and then killed, which matches the description of the remains found in the cave. So the last Hasmonean king appears to have been crucified and then allowed a proper burial, even though he was another declared king who was executed under Roman rule. Thus, all this data combined further supports the biblical account that Jesus would have been allowed a proper burial. Regarding Roman sources outside of Judea, it is true that there are several passages that scholars like Bart Ehrman cite, which suggest that bodies were left to rot on their crosses. But there are additional sources, other than the ones I already cited, that suggest crucified victims could be buried. Craig Evans highlights the Digesta, which says, the bodies of those who were condemned to death should not be refused their relatives, and the Divine Augustus, in the 10th book of his life, said that this rule had been observed. At present, the bodies of those who have been punished are only buried when this has been requested and permission granted, and sometimes it is not permitted, especially where persons have been convicted of high treason. The bodies of persons who have been punished should be given to whoever requests them for the purpose of burial. This fits with the description in the Gospels, where Joseph of Arimathea requests the body of Jesus for a proper burial. Mike Lakota highlights something attributed to Quintilian, which could read as for those who die on the cross, the executioner does not forbid the burying of those who have been pierced. If this is the proper translation, then this passage supports the Gospel of John, which records Jesus was pierced, supporting the notion Roman officials would have permitted a burial. Philo also notes a custom in Egypt. I have known cases when on the eve of a holiday of this kind, people who have been crucified have been taken down and their bodies delivered to their kinsfolk because it was thought well to give them burial and allow them the ordinary rites. So Philo directly tells us on the eve of a holiday, a crucified victim could be buried, if the governor allowed it. So all this data provides sufficient background evidence to support the notion Jesus could have been buried. So skeptics cannot just dismiss the gospel accounts from the background knowledge alone. When it comes to the specific evidence for the burial of Jesus, we have several reasons to support the gospel account. First, the burial of Jesus is multiply attested. The early creed in Paul, preserved in 1 Corinthians 15, says Jesus was buried, and scholars note this likely goes back to within a few months of Pentecost. Scholar Dale Allison notes the Greek word for bury in this creed would rarely be used for a body being tossed in a mass, unmarked grave, and more likely refers to receiving a proper burial. The verb means bury, and would hardly be used of unceremonious dumping of a criminal into an unmarked trench as dog food. That was not a burial, but it's denial. Now, whether or not 1 Corinthians 15:4 summarizes an early form of the story about Joseph of Arimathea, it would be strange, as Barnabas Linders observed, to include this detail in the statement if the burial of Jesus was in fact unknown. The early Passion narrative in Mark also says Jesus was buried in a tomb. Bart Ehrman notes it is widely thought the Gospel of John did not rely on the other three Gospels for its information, which would count as another independent source for the burial of Jesus. Even if he is wrong, the early sermons preserved in the book of Acts have been shown to have an Aramaic structure, and also independently attest to the burial of Jesus. Jody Magnus notes the burial of Jesus fits with standard burial practices from that time period. I believe that the gospel accounts of Jesus' burial are largely consistent with the archaeological evidence. Although archaeology does not prove there was a follower of Jesus named Joseph of Arimathea, or that Pontius Pilate granted his request for Jesus' body, the gospel accounts describing Jesus' removal from the cross and burial are consistent with archaeological evidence and with Jewish law. Dale Allison also points out there is no reason for the early church to fabricate a tomb story. Are we to believe that Christians who acknowledge the humiliation of crucifixion were somehow unable to allow that Jesus was denied a decent burial, as though the latter were so more dreadful than the former? If the gospel authors were just making up legends, they could have just had Jesus thrown into a mass grave, and at his resurrection, also brought all the bodies back with him to life, similar to what Matthew says happened at his death. This would also better fit with Old Testament prophecy. As J. Spencer Kennard remarked, if Christianity had fashioned the entombment on the basis of prophecy, it would have left the body, because of Isaiah 53:9, with the corpses of other criminals. Allison notes, to instead depict a member of the Sanhedrin, the very group that had just murdered the Lord, as the one providing a tomb, goes against the tendency of the Passion traditions. The Gospel authors have to go out of their way to point out Joseph was exceptional and different from the rest to explain why this happened. We also can argue it would have been beneficial for the administration of Pilate to allow for the bodies to be taken down on Friday before the Sabbath, as having the bodies up during a Holy Week would have caused unnecessary unrest the Romans would have had to deal with. Now, we did a specific video on Pilate, where we pointed out he was okay with upsetting the Jews at times, but evidence in Josephus shows us he didn't want to take things too far, and Philo indicates he feared losing favor with the Emperor Tiberius, and that pushing the Jews too far caused him to reach out to the emperor to complain. So keeping the bodies up during the Sabbath and during the Passover celebration, while the city was flooded with pilgrims, bolstering the Jewish population, would probably have been a dangerous thing for Pilate to do. So allowing the removal of the bodies seems like a pragmatic decision. Even Gerd Ludemann admits, the release of Jesus' body and its removal from the cross might also have suited Pilate, because this would a priori avoid unrest among the large numbers of visitors for the festival. In fact, the burial of Jesus is unanimously attested in all early sources that speak of what happened to Jesus' body. There are no competing traditions that suggest something else happened. Why should we posit a completely different theory that has no attestation and is only supported by sources that are talking about a different time in a different place under different circumstances. Again, no one is denying that some Roman sources do say victims could be left on crosses for days. But there is no evidence to suggest this was an unbreakable law enforced in every province for all time within the empire. Especially considering that we do have evidence in other sources that crucified victims could be buried. This is also confirmed in the archaeological record, and that Jewish sources express the importance of burying bodies. Rome allowed the Jews to continue their sacred rituals and customs. The burial of Jesus is multiply attested. It fits with the description of standard Jewish burial practices. There is no reason to make up the entombment story. Pilate would have had a valid reason to allow the bodies to be taken down. And there is no competing early tradition for what happened to the body of Jesus. Given all this evidence, it seems highly probable that Jesus was buried in a tomb, as the Gospels record. And even if this external and archaeological evidence didn't exist, that would not mean the Bible is wrong when it reports that Jesus was buried. The biblical sources report Jesus was buried, and there is no reason to doubt them on such a simple claim. Why is it for some skeptics that the Bible is always guilty until proven innocent?